Over the summer, as you know, the Active Travel England have picked up Brian, formerly of this parish, is now head of inspections. They've appointed Danny Williams, who was tweeting a city cyclist, formerly chief exec of the New Statesman Group, so he's a business person. He's the chief exec, which I think is excellent news for everybody. They did a session with the House of Commons Select Committee on Transport, I think it was a week ago, and if you wanted to watch that, then it's worth watching that, and that actually gives a recap of all the things they've been doing. So I won't go into repeat what they've said. If you want to, if somebody can find that and retweet that. The main thing is that they asked all the local or the highway authorities in the country, as in the chat, to publish the details. All but one council responded. This is a self-survey of both detailed and generic performance on active travel, and councils were asked to rate themselves from 0 to 4. 4 being we seem to have moved here from the Netherlands by mistake, and 0 being we don't care about what this thing, we've never heard of active travel, what is it? So most councils are going to be 1s and 2s. As in the chat, we don't know if it'll be published. Most councils, I think, are 1s and 2s. There may be the very small number of 3s. And Active Travel England, and presumably Brian and his team, have gone through all those results and sort of moderated them. So the ones that have over-egged their own results, because it was a self-assessment survey, have been essentially told don't overrate yourself. I can't speak for the one that I know of, but I know of at least one that over-egged themselves. And this has resulted in the Capability Fund, which is now called Capability and Something Else Fund, if anyone can remind me what something else is, which is a revenue fund for this year, which funds officers and training. The Active Travel Fund 4 will happen soon, let's say, and it probably will be 3 years. It'll probably be, they said anytime now, and submissions by December to be funded by March, and then it'll be the 3 following years, and it'll be 700 million in total for the whole country over 3 years. So that's about the 200 million that councils have been getting in the past, all subject to Treasury disimprovements and so on. And that's where we are. So if your council fails to miss or fails to address that deadline, then they may not just miss out on 1 year, as happened in the past, but 3 whole years. But they've brought, Chris Boardman and Danny were very clear. They want to help councils. They want to help councils develop their bids. And I know that if Adam Reynolds is here, I know that he said that Bath and North East Somerset have been working actively with Active Travel England, and they definitely want to help. They definitely say that they want to help councils develop the best bids. But on the other hand, if a council doesn't want to engage, they're not going to try and force themselves in where they're not wanted. And that's about it, really. If somebody can find them, oh, the link's up there, so that's great. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Mark. That's a good, succinct summary of where we are. I think we're all kind of wondering what's going to happen now with the change of government and what have you. But, you know, it does sound like there's a lot of quite good work going on in the background, and it's just going to take time, no doubt, for that to filter through. Has anybody else got any news they would like to share?
Yeah. Leicester, I think we're getting a Dutch-style intersection outside the new bus station, which is a zero gravity bus station or zero carbon bus station. They've just spent months building it on the site of the old bus station site, and now they're going to dig up the roads all over again to do a new layout at St Margaret's. But it should be really good once it's up, and obviously we're starting work on the 1930s cycle paths that are being regraded, and we got money from government to do that. So yeah, quite a lot happening in Leicester. It's been the summer and I'm a bit disconnected, but yeah, it's we're a 3, clearly a 3, certainly by ambition.
It's all sounding very positive, though.
Where are you?
Leicester.
Leicester. Yeah.
Where the dead kings live, you know.
I mean, I'm really interested. I'm really interested to know how, you know, the stuff kind of going in on the ground yet, because we're still waiting in Newcastle for anything to be made permanent here. We've been told it'll be made permanent, but we haven't seen any digging yet. Robin.
We've got a lot of that. Yeah.
There is digging. Robin.
Yeah. So quite a lot of news from Oxfordshire, of which I'll give you a brief summary. so in order from strategy downwards, the strategy, so Oxfordshire approved its new LTCP, which is the Local Transport and Connectivity Plan. They added the connectivity in with sensitivity to telecoms replacing some of the transport in terms of COVID. I think the significant things about that is that it has a targets include 25% reduction in car journeys across the county by 2030, and it's a fairly rural county, and then another third by 2040, which means if you do the maths, it's a 50% reduction in car journeys, which even we in our consultation response said, hold on, we think you might be being a bit ambitious, but no, they went ahead. And what's more, the plan was approved unanimously. So Oxfordshire is currently led by what's called the Fair Deal Alliance, which is an alliance of Lib Dem, Labour and Green Party. But this means that the Conservatives also supported this. So they're not going to be able to complain when the plans come to follow up the strategy. And it's also got built into it net zero by 2040 and vision zero. So the elimination of casualties, don't say accidents. So that's good. Then the first area strategy which comes from that is the Oxford area strategy. Has a different name, but that's, don't worry about that. It's very good. It's got 22 actions about reducing traffic, motor traffic, increasing active travel, increasing bus services. I was very impressed by how comprehensive it was. So that's good. That's currently in consultation. And then the first action that came out of that is for 6 strategic traffic filters across Oxford, with the ambition of reducing motor traffic, of course, and making it easier to cycle and improve bus journeys. Right filters, right places, but a whole bunch of permits and exemptions, and they only operate 7 till 7. So that's where it starts failing a bit, because this is, it will, I think it'll be enough to make the buses flow more smoothly, but we've got mostly painted bike lanes, and this will get the traffic volumes down to the high single-digit thousands of vehicles per day, not the low single digits you really need to make cycling safe on that kind of road. So we're asking for more now. Other things that are happening in practical terms, we've seen the implementation over the last few months of more quickways, which are essentially more of those painted bike lanes. The main advantage of those is the removal of street parking, which means you're not constantly ducking out from parked cars because they're not full protection, but not having to avoid the cars is a benefit. And then Broad Street, which is a wonderful street in the historic centre of the city, has been the home to 25 parking bays. Those parking bays are now gone, and they're going to be replaced by a kind of pedestrian seating area, a bit of greenery, and be turned into a nice pleasant space over the next roughly 3 or 4 weeks. So if you come and visit Oxford in 3 or 4 weeks' time, that place in the middle should be a lot nicer. There we go. There's more going on than that, but
thanks, Robin.
Stop there.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. We've got loads of hands up now. So yeah, if everybody can try and keep it to a minute or so, if that's possible. Don't worry if it's not. Martin.
Just a short thing from the Isle of Wight. I'm director of a community interest company called People Powered, delivering a sort of range of active travel projects. And we've done a series of pieces of work around cargo bikes. Started off with a piece of work commissioned by the local authority, which was just to sort of report into what the feasibility was on the island for cargo bikes, which we thought we were on a bit of a hiding to nothing with in terms of the practicality. But we did the report, discovered there was more interest than we realised. Then managed to get some funding for a really sort of quick and dirty three-month pilot project, followed by some funding for an enhanced pilot project. And the positive news out of that from the hard graft of the people who are directly involved in it, which is not really me, is that they've now managed to float off a separate business that's going to be taking on the customer base that was built up during the trial, and they're running commercial services now, with some really exciting expansion things coming up in the near future. I just think it's really positive on a little island with population of 140,000 that they've managed to get a meaningful cargo bike operation running in a rural area. So
yeah, that's fantastic, and it's definitely not all flat either.
No, not at all.
Becky, over to you.
That's it. Hi. Yeah, well, what Martin was just saying is relevant. I just wanted to keep people aware of Transport for the South East, the regional body. It's just completed its consultation for a 45 billion 30-year investment plan. And it's taken a lot of my time doing a response on behalf of Cycling UK South East region. It's got 90 road schemes, 44 due to be built before 2030, but it's got a lot of stuff that sounds good about active travel, and people, I think, keep an eye on this organisation because you know, the certainty of the delivery of the road schemes is far higher than the active travel content, and it's composed of 16 councils and a number of LEPs. That's local enterprise partnerships. So you know, individuals and even small groups are really small fry when you look at what's going on regionally, and they're seeking statutory status. And this is a kind of quite a long running thing. So just to sort of raise awareness, keep an eye if you can. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Becky. Claire.
Hi. Yeah, I'm still on holiday, so I'm definitely out of the loop with anything sort of recent in Greater Manchester. But I thought I'd just flag up, just I guess with the start of the new sort of run of Ideas of Beers, that we're at quite an interesting time with active travel in Greater Manchester in terms of, I think what we're seeing, and it might be interesting for other people to think about this, is how making a more direct link between public transport and active travel. We've been involved in a series of behind the scenes meetings with the mayor and the new transport commissioners, and we're definitely feeling that politically it's easier, and also, you know, in terms of trip training and how people actually get about, that kind of thinking of active travel as part of a way that people get around, not just a piece of transport in its own right, while that is important as well. And a good example of that is that Mayor's sort of push forward on the fare cap on buses in Greater Manchester. That came in last week. That's a regional thing, even though the government's doing that from January for 3 months. We're doing that in Greater Manchester. And really interestingly, that is predicated on the cap on the fare leading to an increase in use of buses. And if it doesn't, then, you know, they won't be able to afford to do that for very long. So I think it's in all of our interest to kind of think about public transport, talk about public transport, link what we're doing to public transport. And in Greater Manchester, we're going to see a revamp of the kind of B network vision later in the year. The new transport commissioners haven't really made too many public pronouncements, so it'd be interesting to see kind of what spin they put on it, and I'm sure that public transport will be involved. And on that note, we had a small victory where the mayor promised a trial of bikes and trams in Greater Manchester in his campaign manifesto 2 years ago in the elections, and that sort of had died a bit of a quiet death, and nobody knew what was happening. But through various Twitter accounts and things, that kind of has been surfaced, and it looks like we are going to get a trial of bikes on trams in Greater Manchester, and that's a real example of kind of, I think, a campaigning success. We're just being persistent and being annoying, and has hopefully worked. So, but I'm a bit out of the loop, but I think that's a good summary in terms of the bigger picture of the year.
Thanks, Claire. Also, sometimes those campaigns, they're going on a long time, don't they? It's a long time before you see the outcome. There's a long delay. Max, have you got?
Yeah, I've got a small picture really of what's happening locally, some things that have been happening locally. Actually, one of them I've been corresponding with Becky about. Transport Focus had the client of the National Highways earlier in the year to look at 4 specific main roads and how people use them walking, cycling or riding horses. And both Becky and myself and people from Cycling Lewis and others contributed after being invited. Lots of opinions, lots of detail, enormous amount of detail was given to the consultation being run by Transport Focus. And we've just seen the summary report, which is dreadful. No detail mentioned in it whatsoever. 1 page allocated to each of the 4 sites discussed. And they say there is going to be a full report and all comments will be submitted to National Highways. But I don't expect very much now at all. Very disappointed by what they've done so far. Local, what's this one? Need to put my glasses on to read this. Yes, our local council has been running a consultation on how to get households to remove their wheelie bins and recycling boxes from the pavements, because they're big obstructions to everybody who uses pavements. And there's just thousands of them all over the pavements of Brighton and Hove. And the local council ran this consultation for a few months, 6 weeks, I think, but the consultation itself is terribly weak in structure and awful in content. So there's several of us, Living Streets, I'm a member of the Active Travel Group, and the local disabled campaign group are all asking for the consultation to be annulled and for something better to be done, because the consultation is framed in such a way that there's only one outcome. People are going to be fined, which is not going to help anybody. Finally, some good news. 20 bicycle secure and weatherproof bicycle hangers that residents can rent spaces in were installed before the summer, and now another 40 more are going in this year. Each cycle hanger has space for 6 bikes, and they occupy spaces that were previously used for residents' parking bays, and they will generate more income than the parking bays. That's it from Brighton and Hove.
Thanks, that is good news. Simon, I think you were a little bit late joining us. We are crowdsourcing news. Bob isn't here, but it is something that we're going to be doing going forward. So if you have a London update, that would be fantastic.
Well, I can throw that on top. I was actually going to come back on Claire's point about buses very briefly from a London context, but I'll do both very quickly.
Yeah,
so the main London news is, I think, fairly good generally, one of which is we finally have some funding. We're not running out of money and constantly being threatened to be in bankruptcy. So that's quite a good thing, £80 million a year for active travel, which is far less than was mooted before, but actually probably works out to about as much as TfL has managed to spend generally each year at its peak. So I think that the biggest peak was meant to be about 160 million, so theoretically double, but actually they only managed something like 115 million. So yeah, broadly good news on funding for active travel. Although the bad news is Silvertown Tunnel is being bored right now, etc. So still not entirely coherent. Other good news is, as of today, there is a diversion route around Buckingham Palace for those who are very moved by the Queen's passing, etc. I don't know why I was slightly moved then, because to be very honest, I'm not massively moved by the Queen's passing, but there you go. So the good news is that there is a proper diversion route around it, but it is massive, it's circuitous. But this is the first time Royal Parks Westminster Council have done or considered doing anything like that, so that's quite a good sign. On buses, I was just going to say, we are expecting a refresh of London's strategic cycling analysis, which is like a massive big data crunch of where the priority routes in London. It's kind of the London equivalent of PCT.bike or something like that. And one of the things that's been discussed at the moment in TfL and amongst their analysts and with us and various things is the fact that so far things like PCT.bike and and for that matter, the strategic cycling analysis are very often based largely on commuting journeys. So the kind of journeys that people make when they're going to and from work. And what that does in a kind of classic, quite sexist way is it misses out loads of other journeys, particularly the kind of journeys made by women who are not as often commuters riding bicycles or driving cars for that matter to and from work. So there are a whole bunch of other types of trips that just get missed out from this kind of planning. And I think certainly TfL are now talking very openly about saying we need to rebalance the way the strategic cycling analysis works and looks at trips to amenities, trips to transport hubs, trip chaining, you know, multimodal trips, all sorts of stuff like that. They're now saying that they need to put into their modelling for where important cycling schemes are, and they're recognising, I think, that kind of trips into town centres is a really big issue for outer London, for instance, that the strategic cycling analysis hasn't properly captured so far, and they're aiming to capture it going forward. So that's, I think, fairly good news. The bad news on buses is certainly in London, and I'm sure elsewhere, the whole commercial basis, the way buses are run generally, etc., means an awful lot of bus companies and an awful lot of bus operators and an awful lot of the people involved in TfL who do stuff around buses tend to view cycling particularly, but active travel in general, as a threat. So they see, you're going to come and take our bus lanes away, you're going to come and take our bus priority measures away, you're going to slow down buses at junctions because you're trying to increase safety, etc. So we're having quite a pitched battle between kind of active travel and buses in London behind the scenes, as it were. The good news of that is there are some ways of kind of getting out of that, you know, this versus that kind of rubbish, and bus gates is the really obvious one to this. Like, you know, you put in a bus gate, it basically means loads of people cycle because there's very little other traffic other than buses. The buses get sped up, everyone kind of wins. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of bus gates go in now and talked about, and that I think is going to be a broadly good thing. But if you get a chance to go and look at Stoke Newington Church Street or Bank Junction or Bishopsgate in London, you can see kind of how it works really, really well. So yeah, that's my bits.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. Mark, you've got your hand up. Can we keep it really short so that we can get on to our...
This is a separate piece of thing to what I was speaking about earlier. We're working with Lambeth on school streets, and we're working on about 40 odd schools in Lambeth for school streets at schools that haven't already got them. And it's interesting what Simon said about bus gates, because we're looking at school street type bus gates. But as of Monday this week, we're now the proud owners or managers of 26 live air quality monitoring stations, doing real hourly counts in Lambeth. So I'll put the link up for you to look at. And but that's quite interesting, because the idea is to show that after the school streets have gone in, the air quality should be better for at least those 2 hours. And that will be a tool for everywhere else, hopefully.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We have that outside schools in Newcastle, and there are Twitter accounts linked up to them that give you a weekly update on what the air quality is outside schools and a number of other places. So that might be worth looking into. I think I picked up one other thing in the chat. Saskia mentioned there's an event about organising critical mass, which is that tonight, I'm not sure, but also there is another international critical mass weekend coming up on the 24th and 25th of September. So if you were interested in getting involved in some way, it might be an opportunity to do that. And then I think we're going to move on now to our speaker, Dulce Pedroso. We had, in fact, and actually who was recommended to us by somebody who regularly attends, and we had picked up on her blog, and we thought she would be the perfect person to start the run off. Anyway, I'll let her say more about what she's going to talk about. Do you want to try sharing your screen? Hopefully this all works smoothly this time.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sally, and good to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. Somehow I've completely missed this avenue, which is weird considering the amount of time I spend in the cycling and active travel Twitter, but I'm glad it's been fixed now. Yes, so I'm here today to talk about a project that I did last year called Still I Ride, which, as Sally said, is about discourses in cycling. and how women of color in particular challenge these discourses, but also use cycling to challenge other sort of dominant discourses. Sorry, I said discourses about 5 times in an opening statement. My daughter says that I say way too often, so that's noted for the next time. So my name is Dulce. I put the pronunciation there because I sometimes forget. Here I am in Finland in 1986. This is where I grew up, so quite a different cycling scene from the UK, colder for sure. And 35 years later, I think, I am now in Britain, riding around in my SUV, and I am, that GIF is a bit annoying, so I'll go back. I am an international development consultant during my sort of 9-to-5 life. So that means that I work on projects for the former Department for International Development before that got abolished or merged into what is now called the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office or something like that, the FCDO, which often means that I am working on projects in sort of fragile and conflict affected environments, but not these ones. But in the last year or so, I've specialized, at least in my own time, in sort of connecting the dots between local and international development. And I did my master's degree recently in communications for development and made the case to my supervisor that local travel and active travel is very much a global issue and a development issue. And they bought that argument. So that's basically what I've been doing for the past year. The title, if you didn't spot already, it's just appropriating, paraphrasing the great poet Maya Angelou. And it focused on how dominant discourses around cycling, gender and race play out in the experience of women of color who already cycle, and how these discourses are being challenged. So obviously we all know that cycling has always been about more than its health and economic and environmental benefits. We are all familiar with the history of women's cycling and how that links to the political emancipation, how the suffragette movement contoured the history of cycling. Although we are less familiar with the stories of how cycling itself reproduce some of these racist dominant discourses. So here we have a picture of Kitty Knox, who was an impressive cyclist in the late 1800s and wasn't allowed to enter the League of American Wheelmen, I think it was called, until very late in her career and after a sort of lot of resistance and campaigning. Obviously, a lot has changed now, not least these glamorous cycling outfits. But still, the point I wanted to make is that cycling continues to be linked to ideas about who can be visible, who can take space in public, and how. And mainstream media coverage, as we all know, reinforces certain narratives, portraying cycling as an unsafe annoyance to other road users. So I would say sticks and stones may break our spokes, but it is discourses that really can and do hurt. So one of the inspirations for my research was, in fact, a Sustrans report from 2019, which found that in 2 years, I think from 2017 to 2019, out of 600 media articles that they looked into that featured either walking or cycling in the UK, only 18% depicted women, and not one single one had a picture of a person of colour. And even those 18% that had a female, a picture of a woman, was often in a sort of a negative, voyeuristic way to emphasize sort of the negative perception of cycling as unsafe activity. Since the lockdowns, thankfully, things have changed, and the unprecedented increase of new cyclists since the pandemic has been an opportunity to change how we see cycling, as well as the people who cycle. So I'm based in Bristol, I forgot to mention that, but I do occasionally now, the hybrid working brings me to London, where I'm at the moment, and every time I come here, my heart just jumps of joy. Sorry, I mix my metaphors because I'm Finnish. And I just been really impressed how London has changed over the last, when I lived here 6 years ago, and now when you have to wait in the traffic lights, like sometimes for 2 traffic lights to get through because there are so many cyclists in front of you. But as highlighted in the recent Walking and Cycling Index, participation is still not equal, and there are various barriers. But I was taken aback by some of the barriers that started to manifest in my research before I even got to the data collection point. So just to give you a bit of background, the idea was to do interviews while riding with individual women around England. So I put a call out on social media and then got contacted by various individuals around the country. I'm going to trial something now. If you have your phones with you, you'll be able to take part in a quiz by scanning this QR code, and that should take you into a question on Mentimeter. And that question is, what is it? It's basically what you think was the main concern, or what do you think the women who got in touch with me were concerned about when they wanted to know more about this research, which involved interviewing them while cycling in traffic. So I'm gonna now magically switch screens. Hey, you're already doing it, and you're allowed to pick more than one option. So you should be able to see the votes coming through. So yeah, so we got quite a few there. We got 14 thinking that the women weren't sure about taking part because they weren't sure if they were real cyclists. There are 4 votes for the worry around the city and the quality of their bike lanes. And then there are a handful of votes for the other reasons. So whether they had a fancy bike, whether they thought they were fast riders or not, and whether they could take part because they lived outside of London. And I should say that I didn't mention, if you didn't spot, I didn't mention anywhere in that social media post where the interviews were going to take place. So I can still see some votes coming through, but I think I am going to spoil this now by providing the right answer. So all of these reasons, apart from the first one, where worries, concerns that that the women who got in touch with me wanted to discuss first. So they said that they didn't have a nice bike. They weren't sure if they could keep up. I didn't put like a minimum speed or anything, and they certainly wasn't intending to be sort of breaking any speed records in city traffic while interviewing and filming somebody at the same time. Well, regardless, that was something that some of the women raised. I was really interested in this. The 2 women who lived outside London asked whether they could take part, which I think says something about the London centricity, not necessarily of cycling, but I guess general opportunities, perhaps. And then, as most of you have guessed, And that's probably kind of sums up the previous concerns, as they weren't sure if they were actually real cyclists. So thanks for taking part, and I'm gonna switch back to my original presentation. Okay, so in the end, there were 9 participants from 5 cities. So London, Bristol, Cardiff, Leicester, Manchester, and I'm missing one. That's terrible. It will come to me later. Or maybe you can work it out from those, from the animation. Bradford. Yes, that's the one. So I'll just play a short 1-minute clip here. So hopefully you saw from that clip that there were women of all ages, all sorts of bikes, and I hope you also saw 9 cyclists. All of the women were accomplished, if you can use that term, in cycling in one way or another, so in very different ways. So I had somebody who had cycled around the world. I had cycling campaigners, local campaigners. I had cycling instructors. I had cycling journalists. So very broad church, and they came with so very different cycling experiences, but yet all of them raised sort of similar questions and issues around expectations around cycling, especially when it comes to representation. So cycling kit and gear and general limiting ideas around what type of cycling is seen as normal. And this may be fairly common barriers in a culture where for many decades cycling obviously has been seen mostly as a sporty, middle class and mainly male activity. But yeah, I think the most striking finding perhaps was that all of them said that, or were questioning in one way or another, whether cycling was for people like me. And I'm going to play a clip from Eden. So
in my mind, especially as someone who's like a woman of color, cyclist conjures up different images than it does for me. And so strictly speaking, I'm probably a cyclist.
Yeah, you ride a bike.
There we go. But would I use that as like one of the terms to describe myself if I was writing a autobiography? Probably not. But there's no reason why that couldn't change. And I think it would be nice to imagine sort of a community where being a cyclist does in fact mean lots of different things, or actually even just seeing more people on the road who look like me would make cycling feel more sort of open, more accessible, and actually saying you can be a cyclist and have box braids in, or you can be a cyclist and struggle on hills, do you know what I mean? That would just be really, really cool. But I think I try not to get too down about the fact that not many women of colour cycle. Instead, I think, well, I'm one who does, and hopefully somebody driving their car to work will see me and think, gosh, I could try that as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So why do I have this picture here? I guess because you might have also seen on social media sort of either snarky or celebratory posts around, oh, well, we now have like the most diverse cabinet ever. But when are we talking about representation? I think we can often see it as kind of just a visual representation without actually challenging some of those underlying ideologies that have led to a situation that some people are not represented or marginalized in the first place. So the concept that I want to talk about is belonging. So rather than representation, belonging is being comfortable as part of a particular group and having good relationship with the other members of the group because they welcome you and accept you. And you can see this like in relation to a small group, as in like they talk a lot about women in this research, about the cycling clubs, but also a lot more broadly at the level of the community, the city, or even society where they live in. So as an example, I'm now going to play a clip from one of the interviewees who I was riding with in Leicester.
Because it's interesting because one of the things, because I was chatting to one of my friends, Mariam, who wears a hijab, and we were talking about cycling during lockdown, and part of it is also for me like this countryside, because this is all area that is just on my doorstep. Like my mum's house isn't too far from here, but obviously it's a real contrast, so it is very white. And like during the lockdown, especially when Leicester had its own lockdown, because this is Leicestershire, myself and Marion were like saying how you feel a little bit self-conscious coming out here, because you're wondering whether people are going to like, because people like think, but what are they doing here, because obviously they're not from round here.
So I think this raises some interesting questions around belonging. So when during the lockdown restrictions, people were speculating, if you still recall that time, on the definition of local. For some, the extent to which one's appearance could pass as local became a more relevant question than the actual distance traveled. So social theorists love talking about power. I didn't mention that so my background is in sociology, so I just love bringing the concept of power into my work, and this was sort of the framework through which I analyzed these interviews. Power is a key concept in critical discourse analysis, and also obviously a key consideration in my day job within international development. Within discourse analysis, we look at sort of meanings that are dominant versus meanings that are marginal, alternative, or oppositional. So cycling exists, and if we are not careful, reflects and reproduces the broader powerful discourses in society. So in general terms, but in the sector that I work in, you hear power being talked about in different ways. So we often talk about power as power over others, whether it's sort of direct domination or just invisible influencing of what others think they can do or what they think is possible to achieve. But I also like to use this framework called the power cube, which looks at sort of different aspects of power. So power to, about being able to act, power with, which describes collective action or agency, and then power within, that describes the sense of confidence, dignity, and self-esteem that comes from gaining awareness of your situation and realizing the possibility of doing something about it. So if you listen to the podcast, which I will link here, of these interviews, you will hear some examples of these. So a power to in this context could be, for example, Mildred using the platform that she has as a cycling journalist in a cycling magazine and start creating content that resonates with beginner cyclists or cyclists that don't feel like so-called real cyclists. Or Zoe, who was able to procure these beautiful Dutch bikes for her beginner cycling group of Asian women who did not want to ride the council's grubby old mountain bikes. And then an example of power with could be the various new cycling groups, clubs and collectives, which you've probably seen cropping up everywhere, that share the mission to normalize having people of different backgrounds represented and visible in cycling. And these groups are obviously not primarily about responding to and processing discrimination, but they share the joy of riding with more people. And rather than safe spaces, mountain biker Anila McKenna calls these empowering spaces. So this is why funding cuts that hit social interventions, including riding instructions and riding buddies and so on, can be particularly disempowering for those who are already underrepresented in cycling. I just had to add this cat meme because I'm a new cat mom. So now, in addition to sharing cycling memes with everyone, I'm also spamming them with some cat gifs. So just before I finish, I just wanted to put up the source of the title of my project, The Great Maya Angelou, and also dedicate this to all the women who are interviewed, who contact me and ask me whether they could participate, regardless of not seeing themselves as real cyclists, because I think they are real examples of having power within, realizing the possibility to change the discourse. So if you're interested in some of these references or the podcast that I referenced here, you can scan this QR code. So I've got all the links there, and you can also see some of my my social media handles there on the slide. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my research and some of my theoretical ramblings with you.
Thank you so much, Dulce. That must have been such interesting research to have conducted, and we haven't got much time for questions, unfortunately, but if anybody has got a burning question, put your hand up. I was just going to ask you, just on a personal level, having talked and sort of spent time with those women, how much it had changed your I mean, obviously that's come out in your research, but did it really change your thinking on some of those, on that issue of kind of discourses and visibility, and then the sort of more kind of, yeah,
I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, obviously self-reflexivity is always like part of this, and maybe I came into the research with a fairly kind of with my political active travel hat on, and quite a few people weren't really that interested in sort of being very political, or they didn't necessarily kind of see what they were doing like in active travel terms per se. So I think I had to kind of adjust a little bit sort of my own attitude and biases around that, and reflect that. Or I probably also carried this idea in my head of what a real cyclist is and how they think. And I think one of the women responded, this was actually, it was a nice ride, but quite a short interview, because I was like, so what do you think about sort of the politics of cycling, and do you think a lot about sort of the inequality on the road? And it's like, no, I don't think any of that when I'm cycling. That's why I'm cycling, so I don't have to think about it. and then we just cycled around the park and I just had a chat about all sort of other things. So yeah, it's a misconception that, you know, if you're kind of like politically perhaps marginalized, that's the only thing that you ever think about. But then at the same time, you could also argue that the very act of doing something that the society perhaps doesn't see or assign sort of your to people of color or women or whoever in this situation will see as underrepresented. The very act of doing something like that is taking part in that counter discourse as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you so much. We if you can send your slides, we will share those as well on the website, so people will be able to follow up some of those links and listen to the blog. But
Will
thank you
do.
again.
Thanks,
Well,
Sally. And sorry, can I also just quickly plug, because I work with I represent Bristol Cycling Campaign, not tonight, but generally. They are having a protest on the 2nd of October, and yeah, I would be a rubbish board member if I forgot to mention that. So if you're around in Bristol on 2nd of October, yeah, check out the Bristol Cycling Campaign Twitter feed to find out more if you haven't heard about it already.
brilliant, and we hope to see you again. Now you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dulce. Right, and now I'm going to hand over to Claire, who is going to take us through the last part of tonight's session, which is just to have a little to talk about the review that we've been doing and plans going forwards for the next few months.
The last session of the last run we did as a kind of feedback session, and we got people's thoughts and asked a few questions. And then as a kind of organising group, we have been doing that ourselves as well, just reflecting on how it's gone, etc. And so what I'm about to share now is the kind of output, the summary of those two things. You know, what do you guys think, or whoever was at that session, and also our own thoughts and what does that all mean. And so the first thing, if you just click on Sally, it felt a good time to do it, partly because, you know, as the facilitation group, you know, we'd taken things on from Brian 9 months ago, and we felt, you know, that things have been evolving and we wanted to keep moving. But we did reflect on, you know, what I guess we could call successes. So the fact that we're still here, that we've grown, that we've heard from a lot of speakers like Dulce, who, you know, is someone who's been suggested from the community. And if you click on Sally, well, one of the two questions that we asked in our kind of feedback session, for those of you who were there, the question we asked was, give us 3 words that kind of sum up what you value about Ideas with Beers. And this was a lovely little Wordle that Mentimeter, which Dulce also used, created of the words. That we had about 50 people on the call, I think, and obviously not everyone was there, but it was nice to see that it's a great visual representation. And I think this represents what Ideas with Beers has become, you know, this sense of it being a community and a kind of supportive space, but also the sharing of knowledge being really key. And you know, we're in this kind of pioneering phase, I guess, of active travel still, and so I think this Wordle is really interesting to see, and nice visual representation of what we've become, I think. So that was the first question we asked. The second question we asked people was a more subjective question, which was, what would you like to change about Ideas with Beers? I think we asked it in a kind of positive way. You know, it wasn't kind of like, what would you rip up, but what would you amend? And I took all of the answers and I've summarized them into themes. And the thing I should say, I'm not sure, Sally, whether you've posted the link in the chat, but this presentation is open for comments. So do feel free to take it away and kind of digest this if you're into that sort of thing. Some people are, some people aren't, and put any comments on it if you like. But the way that the suggestions broke down for people, there were sort of 5 main areas of themes. And the top one was this thing around, you know, making sure that we're bringing in lots of regional updates and avoid the pitfall, the trap of being a bit London centric. And so that was kind of one of the main things that we've taken away. And you saw it today. I mean, ideally, Bob would have been here doing his news update, but you know, we do want to hear more from around the country. And if we, you know, were a paid format, maybe we'd pay someone to do that, but we're not. And we love hearing from everybody. And I think that's a really good way of doing it because it builds on that community point. So I'm just quickly going to whiz through the other 2 main points were, yeah, keeping the content and varied and diverse in many different ways. And then the third point, you know, people had suggestions, sort of more practical suggestions, like, you know, can you post the agenda earlier and things like that, which we've taken all of those things away and we'll try and work on as many as we can. So the next slide, Sally, if you're interested, I'm not going to dwell on these, but these are effectively the kind of 5 themes. So the first one, I will just pause here for a second, which is just to say that, you know, this was by far the greatest area by volume of what people felt in that session, was that, you know, really want to make sure we're hearing from, you know, the breadth of the country, because it's really interesting and there's always different ways of doing things. Next slide. This idea that, you know, continuing to evolve the format. So one of the main things that I think we took from this was that the idea of having perhaps more, keeping it varied, but having more stuff on kind of engineering and infrastructure, and we've got an idea on how we could make that a bit more of a regular feature. Next slide. This was interesting in that, you know, people have picked up on the way that we've that, you know, the importance, I guess, of having a facilitation approach, a way of holding the space that's open and inclusive. And really interesting listening to Dulce there talking about how, you know, diversity is more than representation, and this feeling of belonging being really important, and other things as well. So this next slide illustrates that, on the importance of growing diversity in all its forms, particularly demographic diversity. And what was struck by, you know, perhaps we all need to kind of grow our knowledge about how to do that. It's not as simple as just diversity comes from kind of everything you do, your choice of speakers, the time you're on, the tone, the format. And, you know, it's not easy, and it has to be a kind of explicit, conscious, intentional approach. Next slide. And then there was just these more general suggestions. One of the main ones of which we're going to ask for your thoughts on before we end the session tonight in little groups, is that is it now time to change the name? Is it time for a change of name from Ideas with Beers? And this very much chimed with something we felt as an organising group. So this is something that we are going to propose, that Ideas with Beers changes its name. We feel that it's important because Ideas with Beers has become a thing. It's important to quite a few people. It has a role to play, and that currently the name doesn't really reflect that. And it's quite hard to convey what it is. Every time you explain it to someone new, you have to explain it. It's interesting, you know, Dulce tweeting earlier that she was on the session and saying, but I'm not going to be drinking beer. And if you have to explain something like that all the time, it's perhaps not that great. So we are going to change the name, but we haven't decided what to yet. And that's where, you know, we wouldn't do that without involving the community, because that's what we are. So we do want people's thoughts on that in a moment. And so at this point, I'm going to hand to Sally to go through some of the format tweaks that we're proposing.
Yeah, so as I introduced when everybody arrived, which I will just go over again because I know that some people came in late, we do want to sort of incorporate that format into all that feedback into sort of changing the format. We're not going to do it all at once. We're just going to make some small changes to start with, see how things work, timings, and the kind of things that people like. And so also Bob has been doing a new sort of 10-15-minute news roundup for like 2 years or something now, a year and a half. And that's a lot of work for one person. So we felt that it would be good to keep Bob with kind of coming in with sort of 3 kind of high level items of either national news or something of national, international significance that he feels it's important to talk about. But also, as we started off today, we really want to hear from all of you. So if you're coming every week, then and something has happened that you want to share, then that would be great. We'd love to hear from you. If you think there's something that's happened locally that somebody else could talk about, and you want to invite them, then that also would be great. And so we're going to keep that. That's going to be that sort of first, ideally 20 minutes. So, you know, we need to kind of try and stick to that time, because one of the other things we want to do is try and shorten the whole session, because an hour and a half is proving to be, it's quite long for us. We know it's long for a lot of people who attend, because people do tend to disappear off after about 6:15. So, and then in keeping with that, in that kind of crowdsourcing the news, we'd also like more input from people if you want to be more involved in coming up with ideas for speakers and so on. So we're going to carry on with either having, well, we've tried this a little bit, but we'll have a speaker or two speakers. Sometimes we might have a panel discussion. We might have surgeries about, we talked about campaigning and infrastructure and any other ideas that people have. So that will be our sort of middle slot still. And then we, at the end of every run of sessions, so at the end of every 6 weeks or so, where we normally have a break, we will open up the room for a meeting that anybody is welcome to come to, just to talk about planning for the next run of sessions or ideas for the one after. So we'll make announcements about that nearer to the time, just to remind people. So anyone who wants to come along and just chat about what kind of topics we might talk about, what kind of speakers, we'll share that nearer the time when the dates for those are going to be. And then we're going to finish with just making sure that we can announce the speakers for the next week, and also any news on upcoming sessions, anything else that we need to share with you, to try and close at 6:15. Claire, do you want to continue?
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm not going to dwell on these following slides because I think they're easier to sort of read. So, you know, if you're into this sort of thing, and not everyone is, then you know, do have a look, do comment. The slide deck is open for commenting, or email us, however you want to do it. But as part of this kind of work, we felt because this has become an important thing, you know, we just needed to create a few bits of, I guess, a bit of a framework for it. So we've drafted this draft purpose, which I think is important for things to have: purpose, values, and this is a draft, so if people want to violently object or sort of propose something different, but I think this sums up, having done the kind of feedback session and led our own organisery review, you know, I think this kind of gets quite close to it. So it's about providing this safe, friendly, inclusive and supportive space for people to meet, hear and swap ideas and insights and help each other and grow knowledge, capacity and connections. So I guess what it did for me doing this work was really, you know, this is about a supportive space, and also where we're different is that we are kind of co-created. We are a community-led, as in, you know, there's no sort of paid organisation leading this. We're created by the people who come, and that's a real point of difference. On which subject, next slide, I drafted these kind of values, which are sort of USP as well. So I'm not going to dwell on them again. Do feel free to feedback, and we are going to ask you to get into small groups to feedback in a moment. But, you know, I think the first point is that, you know, we are topical, we are informative, diverse and open, and that point about being community led, that is a key point of difference for us from any other space. And so what we hope to do as the organisers is kind of really help grow that ability for the community to be a community, for the space to be a co-created supportive space. Onto the house rules. So I won't dwell on these, but I really would like people's feedback on these. But as I said, it's not everyone's cup of tea. So if it is, do give us some. But the first point, this is a space for people who support active travel. That's not under debate, although a lot within that is. And then others are perhaps more sort of generic, if you like. You know, we're friendly and respectful. We welcome all experiences. Actually, there are very few kind of hard and fast facts in this. There's just knowledge, and we're sharing knowledge so that people can learn. This point that we're multidisciplinary, so there's lots of different people in different places coming to this space. There's professionals, there's volunteers, there's engineers. You know, acknowledging that it's an eclectic bunch. This point that we are pursuing a diverse and inclusive community. We know that actually that takes work, and we're not necessarily an exemplar of that. So perhaps for all of us, it's about educating ourselves more on what that takes. Next slide. Things like on this one, you know, we manage our own airtime. So it's on, you know, we do believe we need light touch facilitation, but it's beholden on all of us as part of this community to manage our own airtime. So if you're speaking for too long, maybe that little voice in your head, which mine is starting to now. So I will keep it clean, we're discreet, and we're all contributors. That last one, you know, we're a community, so therefore it's upon the people who come to create Ideas for Beers. Next slide. We did create this slide is for us as the organisers, but sharing that in transparency, that actually, you know, we take seriously our role, which is creating this space, and that's the most important thing for us. Next slide. That came from, there was an Ideas for Beers code of conduct Brian wrote, but I don't think that was ever made too explicit. So we'll be, once we've had people's feedback, we'll be publishing our house rules on our website, so that, you know, if anyone joins the space, they kind of know what to expect. And also, if issues crop up, we've got something to refer to say, look, this is kind of how we do things here, once people have fed into them. Next slide. Just to say that we have also tried to improve the kind of practical side of things. So we've got our own Zoom now, which we didn't have before. We've created a newsletter, which in general, we would have sent a reminder out before today's session. Didn't quite get around to that this time because I've been away on holiday. And we've also got a small donations account set up just to cover housekeeping costs like the paid Zoom, etc. And thank you to everyone who has donated to that already. And lastly, to say that we believe that the time is right for a name change. I've been loving all suggestions in the chat. Here were 3 that just we came up with in discussion, but you know, you may have better ideas. We're not going to have a vote on it tonight, if indeed ever, but it'd be great to hear people's suggestions. We think the right time for this would be the end of this year, so that for 2023 we kind of forge ahead with our new name, Active Travel Ideas, which is a sort of just a, I guess, the simplest change. Active Travel Cafe, something that conveys the sense of this being a space where you can chat and mingle and perhaps has that sense of community, all about active travel, and other ideas. Active Travel Chat was suggested in the chat, which I quite liked, and I haven't seen all of the other ideas. So, but I think that's where it's important to also, if you're coming up with a name, think about the purpose and the values, because the name needs to kind of reflect that. So thank you for letting me share that, and I think it's important that periodically we just check in on where we're going, and do feel free to comment, and I will pass back to you, Sally, for the next bit. Strong feeling that, you know, informality was good, and being able to contribute, you know, it makes it more accessible for anyone to contribute if it feels informal and not too like, oh, I've got to get on a big speaker platform, and the fact that people can feed back in different ways, the chat, don't have to necessarily speak. Rachel made a really good point about the way to think about things is maybe not necessarily about London, but about where you've got cities, you've got towns, and you've got rural, and you've got a bit of connectivity as well. So just keeping tabs on that breakdown, I thought it was a really good way of thinking about it, because, and if it didn't come across, you know, obviously there is a lot going on in London. We need to hear what's going on in London. It's really useful. It's just getting that balance right. And again, someone in our group made a really good point that I'm not sure I'd captured in the slides, which is just this: what's really useful is the national view, in order that people locally know what they need to go into bat with their local councils, or so I think there's something there for us to think about that's important from that news bit, and our speakers too, arming people with that information. Really good. So yeah, that's it from me, but brilliant. Thanks for everyone.
Thanks, Claire. Does anybody else have anything to add to that, or to feedback? Any inspired ideas for names? No. Well, on that note, I think we will finish. We will be looking through all of that and sort of taking notes from what you've said tonight. I think it was also really nice. It was really nice to chat to people in small groups. So I hope other people enjoyed that. Perhaps something we will try and do again. We'll see you all next week then. And thank you very much to everyone.